What does spending $29,000 on 8 different agencies to book you guest spots on podcasts really get you? Well, 125 appearances in, Chris Burres has some real insight into how guesting on other podcasts has helped generate sales for his supplement business and grow his own podcast. But it's not just the good. He also shares some real data of his experience, which allowed him to determine what was working and what was a waste of time. He also was served a real big slice of humble pie by one of those agencies. You may be a little shocked by what they told him, but it may actually be applicable to most of us on this journey of growing our audiences. Chris Burres is the founder and chief scientist at MyVitalC, as well as host of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. My name is Joel Oliver, and this is Profits Through Podcasting. Hello, Chris.
Joel, thank you for having me. I'm excited to kind of brainstorm and share stuff related to podcasts.
Yeah, same. And we've had a couple of conversations prior to this already, and it always gets really interesting. So I try to put a pause on that and save it for now. So here we are. Let's set the stage first of all. So you are the co-owner of MyVitalC. Can you give us a brief summary of what that business is all about?
Yeah. So I'm going to start literally at the beginning. We started the company, the main company, a lab in 1991, and we've been manufacturing this molecule. You and I are on video. I know a lot of your listeners don't have video. Don't worry. Just imagine a soccer ball where the lines on the soccer ball represent the bonds between the carbon atoms. So we have a spherical molecule of 60 carbon atoms. We call that molecule ESS60. And I'll do the briefest version of this. The molecule's amazing. It performs as well or better than the current best material in almost every application. It makes better inks, better batteries, better tires, better photocells. And those are not things that are typically associated with a health product, right? So this is kind of interesting. It was discovered in 85. The scientists who discovered it won the Nobel Prize in 96 for that discovery. So a short 11 years from discovery to being awarded the Nobel Prize. We started manufacturing it in 91, so 5 years before they were awarded the Nobel Prize. The molecule they thought would be toxic for various reasons. They put it in a toxicity study. Instead of being toxic, the test subjects that they gave it to, in this case it was Wistar rats, lived 90% longer than the control group. So that kind of changed my trajectory and my business partner's trajectory from being happy-go-lucky carbon nanomaterial scientists, I know that sounds wacky, but we are, into the health space. And so then it was kind of my role as the marketer to figure out, okay, a couple of things. On the science side, is this a big deal? Like, is a 90% extension of life huge? I certainly thought it would be. I certainly have discovered that it is. And then what might the mechanisms of action be? And then how do we turn around and market this? How do we get the kind of understanding of this initial study? How do we balance like the FDA, the FTC, and share what we can with listeners like on podcasts? That's been our most successful marketing strategy in ways that are compliant and deliver value. And I think that's the long and short. I don't know if there's anything else to add there.
Okay, great. Yeah, I definitely, if we have time, want to talk a bit more about the actual, what you're doing with the molecule and the science there. So we'll come back to that if we have time. We'll continue on with the business stuff in the meantime. So we've got that. That's great. Now let's chat about the podcast briefly as well, just to set that up. So it's called Live Beyond the Norms. You're well over 50 episodes in with that at this point. Tell us a bit about that podcast. What are you talking about on there? And were there any specific reasons or goals that you had in mind when you launched that podcast?
Yeah, so I've also written a book called Live Longer and Better, and that's the story of this ESS60 molecule from discovery into the health sciences, and then starting to get into kind of the longevity expert that I have become. I knew I wanted to do a podcast. I've always felt that it was good to do a podcast. I actually used to have a podcast before the current one, which was an SEO podcast. And I had that from, I think, 2009 and finally stepped down last year, early part of last year, because I just always feel as you accumulate information, you should share it with people. And there's 2 reasons you should do that. One is very selfish. As you're sharing information, you actually cement that knowledge in your own head. So when you're teaching is when you really come to understand. And second, just to deliver value to people. I'm going through all this effort and doing all this research and understanding all of these kind of complicated things. Let me break it down easily and then share that, because I really do believe in giving back. And the same thing really happened, started with the book. And actually, I started the podcast before the book. I think I have my first episode recorded way back in 2021, and we actually launched it this year. And what really turned the corner there was I started talking with a company about doing a longevity summit. It's kind of funny. I was interested in it. One of my key things is like, hey, all these interviews that I do for the summit, can I use them on the podcast that I know I need to do? And they were like, yeah. So in my mind, I was like, I pay them. They help me coordinate stuff. But at a minimum, I'm now obligated to make the content that I need for the podcast. So it was really like, how do you kick your own self in the butt? When they first approached me, they're like, you're going to need to interview between 30 and 40 people who are longevity experts who you're going to need to find. And then you interview them. And so my first thought was, man, I think I'll probably be able to do like 25. Hopefully they won't be that mad with me. And also hopefully they'll publish it and, it'll do well. I ended up interviewing 55 experts in longevity. The summit was called Uncovering the Secrets of Longevity, Live Beyond the Norm. So I had the branding for the Live Beyond the Norms podcast kind of in my background. I've been releasing 2 a week. So I'm at, you said 50. I believe you, because I'm kind of not exactly tracking exactly where we are. But the team is releasing 2 podcasts per week in an effort to kind of get caught up. And, my goals with it were, one, cement that information in my own head as I'm kind of reviewing those podcasts. It's me reliving the interviews, getting that content out to people so that they can learn from the efforts that I've done. For each podcast, I tend to do about 2 hours of research, and then the podcasts are about an hour. I love the research. I love the conversations. I love kind of everything about it. And then it also serves as a purpose, because I mentioned that our best marketing strategy is get me on a podcast. So you've got this ability to do reciprocation. Hey, you can be on my podcast. Can I be on your podcast? Like, we went to an event recently called Mindshare, and it's really more practitioners, not end users. And so I go to the show. When you get a deal there, it's a bigger deal because it's a wholesale account, right? And that's pretty impactful. But it can be harder to get that deal. I'm able to extract value out of that environment by finding experts, whether they're the owners of the booths who are there or whatever that looks like. And now I can interview them, and some of them have podcasts so they can interview me. So it really puts me securely in the spot as an expert in the longevity space. And that reciprocation is, I think, of really high value.
I'm really excited to dive into more the guest and what you're just talking about, like the guesting and the reciprocation. But since you mentioned something there, let's talk about this briefly. Not only are you doing 2 a week, which can be a challenge for many people, but you said there's a lot of research and prep that has to go into your episodes as well. How could you keep that up?
I just love it. I love understanding biology. I absolutely love knowledge. I absolutely love digging into things. I am actually thrilled about the longevity space and the potential for longevity and the impact of biohacking on longevity. And so there's no pain in those 2 hours of research. It's just like I get to, effectively, it's my job to go down these rabbit holes that if I had lots of time, I would go down those rabbit holes anyway. And now it's actually my job. And so that couldn't be better.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the business here, just to get the full picture, and then we'll develop into the guesting, because I really want to talk to you about this guesting because you've done it so much. So we'll get some good insight there. But I don't want to oversimplify, so you can expand if needed. You've given us a good rundown of things already, but essentially you've helped to develop these great supplements. There's some cosmetic products as well under the My Vital C brand. You mentioned you're an author. You've got the book, the summit. But if we could boil it down to one big thing, or at least help people understand better, if they're thinking about multiple options as well, is the bulk of your business activity those products, or that's the big focus? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, so absolutely. It's the products, and it is my job. It makes sense for me to be well centered in the longevity space because our product is a longevity product. And so then I can have conversations with whether it's influencers or whether it's just people who attend, we go to Dave Asprey's biohacking conference. We have a booth there. And so I can connect with the biohackers there, and then they have some sense of confidence when I'm saying, hey, this stuff really works, because I believe it really works, they have some sense of confidence that I know the industry, I know the biohacks that are out there. And so that's pretty important. So the end goal is, yes, to get people to have confidence in me and therefore the company, and then make a purchase. And 95% of our sales are online, with probably like 2 to 3% on Amazon.
Great. Okay, so let's dive into this podcast guesting topic, because you've got quite a bit of experience as a guest on other podcasts. You've got a lot of data as well, which I like. So the number that I read, and maybe this is higher at this point, but I read that you've made over 120 guest appearances on other shows at this point. How does that sound? Accurate?
Yeah, I've got 125. And probably that I've been on maybe 20 of those twice.
Okay. So let's start with how you got those guest appearance spots. You mentioned at some point you were contacting them. Did it ever become an assistant helped you, or were you hiring companies? Because it's a lot of appearances. So I'm just curious how that looks.
Yeah, I think if you don't have any budget and you're starting out and you think this might be a good strategy for your business, then you spend your time getting onto podcasts, right? You might be thinking, and by the way, I think like a marketer. My previous podcast was a marketing podcast. And so this is just how I think. You might think that doing a great job on social media is valuable. And I think it can be. I think paid social media is actually a better way to deliver value. By being on a podcast, even if it's a smaller podcast, if there's 100 listeners, you have a story to tell, or hopefully you have a story to tell. And if you're telling that story to 100 people versus one at a time, that's much better. And then on social media, like our story is a little complex. So I might be unique in that the podcast is almost the only way to go. We're working on the right kind of marketing messaging to be able to do more cold traffic stuff. And so maybe there's other products out there that might be your thing that is, hey, I can do it on social media. I don't need this longer form content. But I think if you have a good story, podcasting is just a phenomenal way to create brand awareness and really to drive actual sales. And I've got some stats there. The way I got into it is kind of funny. I'm a part owner in a digital marketing agency, and the CEO of that digital marketing agency was like, hey, I have this guy who's going to he had already decided his strategy was to get him on podcasts. And he calls me and goes, I have this guy, like I'm trying to build a relationship. He's really good at doing kind of smart strategic things. I need you to hire him to get you on podcasts. And I wasn't sold at the time. I was like, I don't know. But I believe in my CEO. That's why he's the CEO. And I'm like, okay. So I paid this guy to kind of foster this relationship. And they ended up getting me on like I think it was one good show that really we saw the return. And every time I go on a show, I'm giving a unique URL. There's a coupon code that only exists on the URL. So we don't give it out during the show. That's very intentional. We want people to go through that to track the data. And so it tracked really well. And then that relationship, he promised me one extra podcast. He never delivered. And like, I'm going somewhere else. Like just this doesn't work for me. And so that's what kind of took me on the road. At this point, I've hired 7 different companies to get me on shows, including my own digital marketing agency, because there are some parallels with what digital marketing agencies do in terms of outreach. And so they have gotten me on shows, but that's kind of how it started. And like I said, 7 companies, 125 different podcast guest appearances at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would love to dive into some of the insights, because I don't even know what data you have there, but people have certainly, if they're looking for these options, they've seen these companies that you can pay to get you guest appearances, and they may think, well, I can already do that myself. Maybe they're not as good. I don't know. Is it worth the price? That sort of thing. So I would love to explore that a little bit to see what your findings actually were. What was your experience?
Let me start here. I think you mentioned a service. I can't remember what it is to try out. So I'm already on it, and I've booked a couple of guests for my podcast. At this point, I would say that they're kind of mediocre to low guests at this point. Like, no offense to them, but in terms of what their visibility is. But for me, I'm looking for really good content. So I'm trying to dig in. I've got to actually do like 20 minutes of research to decide if I even want them on my podcast. And then I've got to do 2 hours of research. But that's a platform. I think it would be inexpensive. Get yourself out there, become a guest, and start doing some guest podcasts. And you kind of want some of your first ones to be lesser known podcasts, unless you're just great on stage and great in camera and all this stuff, because it's uncomfortable. A lot of people are really uncomfortable. I mean, the number one fear over death is public speaking. And now you're public speaking, but in a very weird space where you're talking to a camera. So you want some of those first ones to be lesser known. At this point, I've hired, like I said, 7 companies. Most of the companies want to sell you packages between 6 and 24. You can talk them down to a smaller one just to see how they do. There isn't much data about how much downloads actually occur on a podcast. I think on your first package with whichever company, don't worry too much about that. Just get on the shows. Make sure your story's succinct. Make sure your story resonates. Get friends and family to listen to the story. Because what happens is if you're there to try and sell something like yourself, your services, or your products, the sales alarms go off and now people aren't going to listen. As soon as you start telling a story, those sales alarms go away and now they start listening to the story, and that it just opens up the door. And there's probably room to improve the story. You should do that on this first podcast. So they're looking to sell you 6 to 24 shows. The pricing per show ranges from as low as $180 to as much as $450. And this is how much I've actually paid for shows. And then I have, just to share, is this profitable? Is this something I might want to do? I have spent about $29,000 on companies to get me on podcasts. And I know unequivocally that that's tracked to $82,000 of revenue. I believe it's probably 3 times that, but those people have gone to the links that I've given and have used the coupon code that I've given out. I can directly track to $82,000 of revenue.
Okay, that's great to know. Yeah, you made some good points in there. Like, for example, the website where it's a little more beginner, lower level connections, which, as you mentioned, is fine, especially if someone's just starting out. You don't want your first appearances to be seen by too many people. Just get some practice in.
You don't want to go on Joe Rogan for your first podcast.
Right.
I mean, you kind of want to, but you probably don't want to.
Right. So it sounds like with, say, those companies that you use, maybe some better than others, but they are able to get you higher level connections, because that's really what it's going to take. Is you have to go out and find those other podcasts that are not on those matching sites and contact them directly. Now, would you say with those companies you used, it's not just like you're delegating the process of outreach to someone for time reasons? They actually have connections. What's the big benefit of working with them? Is it the connection? It's not just time, right?
I'll tell you what, of all these 7 companies, no one really seems to have great connections. I just hired a company recently, so this will be my 8th company, and they're in the health and wellness space. So they work on getting you to be a guest on other podcasts in the health and wellness space. And so I'm excited about that, because I know they do, they were at Mindshare. They used to have a booth at Mindshare. Mindshare, by the way, is a health and wellness business growth company, right? Like a mastermind group. And so I'm hopeful that they'll be a little bit more targeted. So I think what I'll share is each of the companies got me on one podcast that was good enough to pay for them, right? But most of the podcasts that I went on were still small, 100 listeners, maybe 1,000 listeners. And so really didn't move the needle. So you ended up kissing a lot of frogs, but each of the frogs, whatever, turned into, a golden egg, whether it was a small golden egg or a huge, like one of them, I got on Dr. Gundry's podcast pre-pandemic. This is from a company that their focus is actually like lifestyle coaching, like people who are selling coaching packages, and high-end coaching packages. And so they just took me on. They're like, we'll give it a try. And they got me on Dr. Gundry's show. Like, they didn't have that relationship. I can promise you that. I got lucky, and the right pitch got in front of actually Dr. Gundry. And so he had me on. So I think each one of them did a good job. I would say, even though the price range was from $180 to $450, I don't think that the $450 per show got me on better shows, right? I think it was fairly evenly mixed with a small margin. I will tell you this. The last company that I hired looked like they could get me on some pretty good shows, right? They talked a mean game. And after a couple of months, they came back and said, your content's good. But the problem with you, Chris, is you're a nobody. And I wasn't even offended because on social media, my YouTube is actually doing pretty well now. My Instagram is probably 2,300, 2,500 followers. My TikTok is probably 3,000 followers. I'm a nobody. You compare me to like Dr. Gundry has 600,000 followers, something in that range. And so this has a lot of value in it, I think, because as long as I was working in the digital marketing agency, we never saw an ROI for organic social media, ever. And paid social media, you can see it because you got the targeting and you got the messaging. That's all right. So I was not a big believer in social media, the organic piece. I feel like you need to do some of it and you should be doing some of it, but I didn't feel that there's any value there. Now I do, because if I have the clout in social media, then I can get on bigger podcasts, right? And so that starts to pair with the Live Beyond the Norms podcast and really the whole strategy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So would you think that you would have been able to do that exact same pitching yourself and get all of those spots had you just went about it? Or the companies did something special, or was just kind of random luck and they pitched at the right time? But it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Like if they're telling you you need to be a little bigger to then get on these bigger shows, right?
Yeah, so that's certainly some of it. I think that the short answer is we probably could have done it all ourselves internally, right? Just figure out who we were going to pitch. Even for, just as an example, this was to get a guest on my longevity summit. There was one lady that I knew I wanted to have her on my show or on the summit. And I reached out to her like through their media contact, through their online form multiple times, and actually finally ended up on their chat on their website and told them that I had been trying to contact her, that I had a short deadline to get this longevity summit done. And finally, their marketing team contacted you or me. So there's no rocket science going on here to get her. She was an amazing interview and her company is quite big. So there's nothing rocket science. It's like, but to have that persistence, sometimes you don't even get that in companies you hire. But if you're trying to bring on an assistant and say, hey, just pop out these emails, they're probably not going to have that persistence inherent to them. And you're more likely to get that with a company who's targeting. But having said that, I would say that even the companies I hired wouldn't have done that, right? Like they've got a mass market. They have, a big email list of the podcast you could be on. They send a bunch of emails with your pitch. And the nice thing that they will help you. And each of them has done a good job of helping me put together a one sheet. Like, what are we pitching? Why would somebody want me on their podcast? What does that messaging look like? What are the questions that they're going to get answered if I'm on their podcast? Those types of things. And that one sheet is really valuable. But I don't think one company did significantly better than another. But some of that has to be like, I come from a marketing background. It's my business. I'm the scientist behind it also. And so I understand the messaging that I want.
Mm-hmm. I think something I'm hearing here too, an important takeaway is there's no overnight success solution. It's not like you pay a company and everything's great. There's all these little things that you've had to improve upon. You've tried out these different solutions. You're learning. If a company's making you promises that sound too good to be true, that's probably the case. It just takes effort. Even if you have money you can put towards it, that kind of thing, there's no just simple way to get results. It takes time.
Yeah, for sure. You've got to spend some effort on it. And some of the more valuable effort after you kind of go down this path is getting on those hopefully lesser shows and honing your message. And that honing process is going to start with that initial engagement with them where they're creating that one sheet for you.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got a good picture there of your guesting. You have your own podcast as well. You've talked about the paid social. You've given some little insights here and there about this. Just to get a clear picture and talk about it specifically, your marketing funnel as a whole, just everything that's going on here with this business. How do you say the proportions are in terms of where the leads are coming from? Are a majority of them coming from podcast guesting now, or your podcast, or somewhere else? Like, how does that split look?
Yeah, at this point, we actually don't have a cold traffic funnel that we've tested. In fact, I've got a couple of funnels that I've done, haven't tested. I've got one that we're wrapping up and is scheduled to be testing kind of going into December, January of 2025. So I would say that the business in its entirety is coming from podcasts. And when I started to, so this is where business owners can often get stuck and screw themselves, in the middle of doing the summit, I had come to the end of one group booking me on shows and didn't bother re-engaging them or anybody else because I was also really busy with recordings for the summit. And then I kind of came on the other side of it a couple months out. I was like, when should you stop the thing that is working the best for your company? The answer is never. And so that's when I kind of engaged the current company.
Okay, great. I think we'll get time to talk about the molecule for a little bit. I just like to kind of wrap up with one final question here. I always like to get an answer from, because people that are listening to this that are maybe have smaller businesses than you, smaller podcasts, that are trying to work their way up, it can sound discouraging where, you know, they hear someone like yourself that seems like, wow, he's been doing it for so long, things are so good, everything is great, but that's not the case. You know, it can look that way from the outside, but what would you say is a current, either a challenge or a priority or something that you're really focused on in your business right now and you need to work on it moving forward that's not perfect?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One, kind of very podcast related, is getting my clout online up, which is not easy, right? You've got to be putting out good content. You got to be tweaking that content and keeping track of what content is working and then recreating that. That is a challenge. And I have a company that I work with that'll do shorts, that'll come to my office and record videos and get those shorts out there. There's a lot of effort. But all of these things are things that you can do on your own. And I think you probably don't, depending on where you're at, you probably don't need to focus on that social media clout first. It's just where I happen to need to focus so that I can get on bigger and bigger shows. I'm also, by getting people on my podcast and then being on their podcast, I'm creating relationships with people who have more clout, right? So can start to do introductions to other people who have more clout. And I do a good job on interviews. I do a good job interviewing people. And so they're very comfortable introducing me up the ladder. So I think that's one of the things that I'm working on. And then like the reality is I don't have a cold traffic funnel that works, right? And for those who maybe don't understand exactly what that is, you're on Facebook, you're scrolling, you see some sort of ad that's compelling enough for you to click it. You click through it. The content on that landing page is compelling enough, which needs to be very compelling for you to purchase right away. That's a cold traffic funnel. If and when we get that to work, that's a better place for me to send the traffic when I'm a guest at other people's shows. Your audience has been with me a while. They have a sense that I'm an honest guy. If they heard the whole story, I didn't even want to be in the supplement market. This is not my desire. This is not the only way I have to make money. And so when they hear enough of that story, they have enough confidence to go to the website. Nothing scares them away. And so they make a purchase. And so that's great. But if that were a more consistent messaging, right? If it were tighter, then we would have significantly more sales. And so what we end up building and putting together that works for the cold traffic funnel will be something that is the thing I send when I go on shows. And one of those is I currently don't have a freebie, although I think I've assigned that to my team. That just reminds me I need to follow up on that. When I go on a podcast, hey, go to this page, right? There's a unique link for everybody. We'll have a unique link for you. And go to this page, and then, hey, you want a free, what are the best longevity supplements on the market? You can get that for free. Just give us your email. And that's an important piece of any sort of funnel that you might have.
Right. Yeah. It's always interesting to hear these, let's call them higher level problems, the more advanced, like what someone at your stage is thinking of in their business versus someone who's just starting out and is not maybe tracking the data of all the podcast appearances they make or being able to afford companies, that sort of thing. So it's interesting to hear what is down the road if you're starting out, or if you are at this level, maybe realizing I should be doing that. Like Chris is doing this, and why didn't I think of that? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so on that, you talked obviously about the molecule. I would love to take a couple of minutes just to, the main thing that stood out to me is the longevity experimental result, like that 90% extension of life. Can you elaborate on that however you need to? But when I hear that, I think, so what, person lives 90% longer? But you tell me.
Yeah. So if the average person lives 90% longer, the average person lives to 152. Okay. There's a lot more research that needs to be done to be talking about those things. The current theory is related. It's called the BOSS theory, buffering oxidative stress system. And let me talk about that theory in a second and just share. So our most consistent testimonial is people take the product in the morning, they report mental focus and energy during the day, and then better sleep that night. And what's kind of profound and very important in that, we all know that sleep is good for our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. So if that's all we're doing is helping sleep in some way, whether it's the length of sleep, the depth of sleep, the amount of NREM versus REM, whatever we're doing that's getting these amazing testimonials, that's already good for your mental, physical, and emotional well-being. When you couple it with another piece, which is, I said you take this in the morning and sleep better at night. I'm not aware of anything you can take in the morning and positively impact your sleep at night. You can get exercise. That'll positively impact your sleep. You can wake up and get exposure to the sun, and that'll kind of get you in line with the rising and falling of the sun, get your circadian rhythm in line, and that will help you sleep. But other than that, like, you really have only the option of prescription sleep aids. And there's a really great book by Dr. Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep that says these sleep aids, the problem is they make you feel refreshed when you get up, but they're actually blocking the REM and NREM sleep, the healing and restorative sleep that you are supposed to be getting. So it may feel great that you're not tired in the morning, but you're not healing. Your body's not going through its natural healing processes. And ours, you take in the morning, those you take at night. So that's our most consistent testimonial. What we believe this is doing is operating on the mitochondria. I've kind of got a longer story. This is, more focused on kind of delivering value to people interested in guesting. So I'll keep this story kind of short. A lot of supplements are really proud to say they operate at the cellular level. The mitochondria, there's a mitochondria, the powerhouse of every cell. There's between 50 and 5,000 of those in every cell in your body. And those produce the energy for those cells to be what they're supposed to be, whether it's a heart cell, liver cell, kidney cell, lung cell. And just like any other powerhouse, there's a negative byproduct, right? Your car going down the road has exhaust. Your power plant has a smokestack. In the case of mitochondria, it produces those. But when that internal mechanism gets overwhelmed, those reactive oxygen species are left of their own accord. I call them like little bumper cars running around, damaging everything that they bump into. And then that's where the ESS60 molecule comes into place. It can hold 6 of these negatively charged particles. And those reactive oxygen species are negatively charged particles. So it holds on to them until those management processes, resources are refurbished or replenished, and then they can take them off of that ESS60 molecule and get them out of the mitochondria. And so by doing this, that's why we say the ESS60 molecule is the boss, buffering oxidative stress system. And if you're improving the mitochondria, which exists at quantities of 50 to 5,000 in every cell in your body. By the way, there's none in blood cells, and there's about 2 million in neurons and brain cells. So if you can improve how that mitochondrial functions or reduce the negative impact when that mitochondria is stressed, then you're going to get amazing testimonials from head to toe. And that's what we have. And we don't need to belabor this. I'm glad I get to deliver value on the side of guests. And if anybody wants, they can reach out to us. We have an amazing team who can answer most questions. And then we're going to have a link that they can go to kind of contact us.
Love it. Yeah, well, you can clearly see that you're well-versed in talking about this material. I love hearing about things like that because that's what got me interested in the health and wellness niche, because you should be proactively taking care of your own health, seeing what's out there. If you just go to the doctor, you're missing out on a lot. And, through podcasting and the internet these days, there's such a wealth of information out there. People like you are doing this research and developing these things. It's so exciting that we can do that. And you can actually make an effort on your own to go and improve your own health and improve your life. And I see that all the time, in the work that we do with our clients and people like you. So thanks so much for sharing your insights on the business and for what you're doing with your products as well. And we'll definitely have a My Vital C link, your podcast, your socials, all that in the show notes. But Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel.
Join us again next time on Profits Through Podcasting for more tips on how to turn your health-focused podcast into a lead and revenue generation machine for your business. And if you're ready to let a team of professionals handle your entire podcast production workflow so you can free up time and focus on the most important tasks in your business, visit EastCoastStudio.com.